بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. So I want to start by thanking Darul Ihsan and the brothers here for inviting me. This is not something that I usually do, and nor do I know how to even approach this topic. But after some persistence, and I got a bit embarrassed keeping saying no, I had to try to oblige and do some topic which is actually quite difficult. It sounds quite easy, talking about the life of someone. And if you kind of consider yourself in terms of how complicated a single day can be, trying to capture these personalities that were active for 70, 80 years in an hour session or 2 hour session itself is an impossible task. Which element of their life do you touch upon? And to further complicate matters is that to understand one person, you need to understand the people around them. To understand the people around them, you need to understand the people around them. So the way you can kind of view this is that we are like a puzzle. If you take me as an example, for you to understand who I am, then you're going to have to understand who my teachers are. You're going to have to understand who my family are. And then when you start studying my family, you just say, well, where do they come from? And then that's the problem with history, that how far back do you go to? So when I was sitting here going through the life and times of Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan, Shaikh-ul-Hind rahimahullah, you come up across so many different figures, and then you see yourself hours investigating some other figure. But then when you investigate that other figure, you start to realize that this person has an impact on this person. So it's a very complicated task. To take on a topic is quite easy, but to go with a personality is extremely difficult. So the goal today is going to be quite simple, inshallah, but quite complicated nonetheless. The simple issue is the topic is going to try to cover. We're going to look a bit about who Shaikh-ul-Hind was, who was Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan, try to do some background information in terms of where did he come from, what was he connected with. We're also going to do some educational things, inshallah, in terms of maybe increase our knowledge about some forms of history, some sort of details, inshallah, you may not be aware of before. And then I'm going to try to delve into a bit more of his statements and perspectives and how we can draw lessons from that. That's the general gist of what we're going to try to do. So before we begin, to start off with, when we're talking about someone like Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan, if you Google the Sheikh's name, his name will pop up as Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan Deobandi. And the term Deoband is a term that I'm sure many of you guys have heard before. This term Deoband, Deobandism, Deobandi, and some may have some awareness of. There'll be certain institutions linked to Deoband. But this is not my assessment. But scholars have also suggested that if you want to understand what Deoband is, then the figure that we're looking at today, Shaikh-ul-Hind, kind of captures all the various facets of Deoband, right? Because there's so many figures that are associated with this Deoband. But this one figure, if anyone has a claim to be an embodiment of what this madrasa represents, it will be very difficult for you to find someone who has a better claim to that than Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan, Shaikh-ul-Hind. So let's start with one more preliminary remark before we continue. As a general advice is that as Muslims, history is always very important. So I've seen these great icons, topics that have been covered, various figures of the past and present, and it's extremely important. But if you lack time, there should be at least two periods that every Muslim should try to study. The first aspect of history that every Muslim should try to study after Seerah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that's an assumption we're going to accept, that's what we're going to study, is the era of the early Muslims. So the Sahaba and the early Tabi'un, that should be something that we should all be relatively familiar with. If I said to you, who was the second Khalifa, everyone should have an idea who the second Khalifa is. If I asked you, what is the Battle of Siffin? What is Jamal? What does Umayyad mean? There should be at least some sort of familiarity amongst us of what this means. So some sort of early Islamic history is important. And the second important aspect that we should be studying is recent history, meaning how did we get here? What was happening in the last 100, 150 years? That has a much more direct impact on us, because all history has an impact. All history, wherever you go to, there's going to be some form of impact. So I've seen some of the figures that have been studied here. Imam al-Dhahabi, you've been studied before, was done a lecture on those. Imam Nawawi done a lecture. These people still have impact on us. But in terms of the most direct impact, where many of our grandparents may have met some of these figures or directly studied with these figures. That is an era that is also extremely important for us to understand, to really understand how we got here right now. And what's happening is that because we're maneuvering or moving away from a reading culture, it's very hard for us to cling on to those things that we just assume that everyone knows to be true. You can so quickly revise history that no one actually knows where they even come from. And that's quite a sad state, this moving away from reading culture. And I'll touch upon this again, inshallah, as we move into the life of Shaikh-ul-Hind. Now, the era that we're looking at, right, it comes from the 19th century. So you look at the 19th century, that's the 1800s. Just in case people get confused with that. When we say 18th century, that means the 1700s, the 1800s. So you shouldn't think of 19th century, the 1900s. That'll be a mistake many people make. So we're looking at the 1800s is when this figure is born. And then we're looking into the early quarter of the 20th century is where the figure we're looking at passes away. So what is this era that we're discussing from the 1800s to the early 20th century? This is where we can say that colonization, this European project of going into the Orient, which is the East, and colonizing those lands, conquering those lands, and taking its benefits back to Europe. This is in a nutshell what colonization refers to. So this era, the 1800s, is an era of British colonization of India, right? And that has a very important role to not just Shaikh-ul-Hind, anyone and everyone in that figure. Just like, for example, right now, if someone's trying to talk about us and not mention that we live in Britain, you will not be able to fully comprehend our way of thinking, our humor, our language, if you don't take in consideration the fact that we're born in Britain. So similarly, when you're looking at these figures, the era is extremely important to understand what were they dealing with. So the idea of Muslims living under non-Muslim rule is not a new phenomenon that we're experiencing uniquely. This is something that has been happening from the 1800s and the past as well, but in large scale, that has started from the 1800s. So during this time period, we have the encroachment of colonization in terms of the Britain are gaining more and more power. This is not what we're going to talk about today, but they're gaining more and more control until they more or less take control of most of India. So in the 1850s, more specifically 1857, you have what is known as the failed mutiny. So the Indians, Hindus and Muslims, they get together, and Sikhs, and the attempt is to try to overthrow the British. How do we get rid of the British? This mutiny eventually fails, and then from there on, Britain officially become the rulers of India. So before that, they rule India, but from the 1857 onwards, they're official rulers of India. In 1851, so we're talking about 6 years or 5 years before this effort to try to oust the British, our figure, Mullah Mahmood al-Hassan, is born. He's known as Shaikh-ul-Hind, but that Shaikh-ul-Hind is not given to him as a title when he's born. The idea of Shaikh-ul-Hind actually comes to his last days. So now when we become accustomed to calling him something, that Shaikh-ul-Hind title comes from his last days, but we're going to refer to him as such and how he attains that title. Now, that's in terms of politically what the situation is. What's the scholarly situation? What's happening with how do you study deen? So in that era, when a person was born, usually scholarship will be restricted to scholarly families, right? So if your family are from the family of scholars, then the expectation is you will be a scholar as well. If your family are goldsmiths, you'll be a goldsmith. If your family is a builder, you'll be builders. For those who are from the subcontinent, you will know this quite where you have families or castes that are not caste in terms of their blood, but in terms of their occupation. So we have these are people that are people who fix shoes. These people are hairdressers, and we make castes based upon that, or we divide society based upon that. So then you have what is known as the class of the ulama. This is something shifting quite drastically now. Why? Because knowledge has become much more accessible, so more people can engage in knowledge. In the past, if your father was a scholar, you would be a scholar. If your father was not a scholar, you could still be a scholar, but it would be more rare. You'll be usually restricted to people that would come from scholarly families, or to some degree have relationship to scholarship. So our figure, Mullah Mahmood al-Hassan, is born within that era.
where his family are also have relationship to knowledge. His father, Maulana Zulfiqar Ali, his name is Zulfiqar Ali, he himself was a scholar but was more accustomed to the science of language, of adab. And this is another thing that I want to point out here as well, inshallah, is that because we're trying to take lessons from history. It's no point just doing history for the sake of it. Taking lessons from history. If you go to this not talking about society in general, because sometimes we look at figures, we would say literacy rate is much more higher today than they were in the past, which is true. If you were to get a random selection of 100 people and see how many could read and write compared to 100 people now, it would be different. But those who were actually literate, their level of literacy was far more greater than our literate folks. So if you go to the average scholar in the 1850s or 1800s or even 1700s, the average scholar, and you compare the level of writing, how they could write poetry, how they could master multiple languages, it's something that most of us can't do. If I said to any of us who are literate in English, produce a solid English poem, right? Or write to me a grammatically sound, solid article. It's something that we struggle to do, even though we're literate. So there was a high level of literacy among the scholarly class, and that was where his father was, his focus was on, in the field of adab, which is scholarly learning. So Shaikh-ul-Hind is Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan. He's born in 1851. What is the scholarly scene at that time? So that's his father, has relation to knowledge. What is accessible to people at that time? Most people in India at that time follow in terms of fiqh, known as the Hanafi madhab. Right? You have the Hanafi madhab, that's what they usually follow in fiqh, but at the same time there is a counter movement taking place. And this counter movement is taking place is that we don't adhere to any schools of thought. This becomes known as the Ahlul Hadith movement. The Ahlul Hadith, just so we're going to get some technical, so be ready for this. The Ahlul Hadith is a movement which is saying that this scholarly schools that we have, we don't need to adhere to them. We can go back to the Quran and Sunnah and weigh up the strength of these positions in comparison to what the Quran and Sunnah says. And of course, because the school that is the most dominant in India is the Hanafi school, the main battleground is between the Hanafi school and these Ahl Hadith scholars. Prior to the 1850s, the figure that plays probably the most pivotal role in scholarship in the subcontinent, which various factions of Ahl Sunnah attribute themselves to, goes back to a single figure by the name of Shah Waliullah Muhaddith Dehlawi. Shah Waliullah is a name that I'm sure most people have heard in some capacity. So Shah Waliullah is someone who is active in the 1700s, the 18th century. And he has 4 sons. The most famous of his son is his eldest son. His name is Shah Abdul Aziz. So Shah Abdul Aziz is the one who kind of carries on his father's legacy. And this is this scholarly circles that are from the family or the tradition of Shah Waliullah is where these disputes are taking place. So Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan is born within that time frame. So what do we have here? We have himself, his father is a scholar. We have this scholarly relationship going back to a figure called Shah Waliullah. He himself is a Hanafi. In terms of what is known as suluk, your spiritual path, he's a Sufi. That's what they were, right? And in terms of their Aqidah, in terms of what were their Aqidah schools, they were known as being Maturidis, right? If you want to ask questions about it, you can take them after, but just for understand the background, that's where they are, the scholarly circles that they are surrounded by. So in 1851, there is no Darul Uloom Deoband, right? But Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan is from Deoband, the actual town of Deoband. But he's born, quite ironically, in the town of Bareilly. Bareilly is where you get the term, you heard the word Bareilwi before, right? It comes from this town called Bareilly. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan's father was working there. So that's when he was born, was in Bareilly, but his original hometown was Deoband. So in 6 years old, or 5 or 6 years old, is when the failed mutiny happens. Now, after the failed mutiny, what we find is that the British response to the mutiny, because now it's failed, what do we do? The brunt of the British force was on the Muslims over the Hindus. And a lot of ulama were executed, a lot of ulama were put into prisons. And that's the scene of when Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan starts to see what's going on around. That's what he sees. So as a young boy, at the age of 8 or 9, this is what he's seeing. This kind of clamp down of these foreigners who have conquered this land, and now the ulama that we look up to are living in fear of what they might do to him, or do to his family, or do to the scholars around him. So what he initially starts off with, going back to his education then, how did a person study in that era? So you would have general institutions, colleges, universities. At that time, you have the Delhi College, which is in Delhi. But most people would, because you have from a family scholars, you would start studying locally. So if you're thinking here, you have Nuam, got Barking. What you would do is your father will send you, or himself will start to send you to various local scholars to recite Quran, to learn Farsi, because that was a language that was of scholarship. And then as you would get older, you might start doing some Arabic, some fiqh, etc. So that's how you will be studying. And if you were being very competent in it, these are private studies, then you may be sent off to a college. If not, you may just carry on completing your studies within various scholars. And then when it came to the big books, the hadith books, you'll be sent to someone who is a very learned scholar and say, go study hadith with that person. And then you'll get qualified and you'll come back. So Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan takes on that task. He's studying at a young age, going to his father, people around. And then at the age of 15, what happens? The Darul Uloom Deoband is born. So that happens in 1866. So 1857 is the failed mutiny. So about a decade later, these ulama come together and say, we need to set up a madrasa. What's the rationale behind the madrasa? What's happening here? Well, clearly taking up arms with the British has failed. So once that's failed, you don't just give up. You say, okay, what do we need to carry on? How do we preserve our identity? So what's better than setting up an institution, a madrasa, where we can get students to come here to study, and then once they study, they can go and teach people back in their localities, and this way we can preserve our deen despite British rule, despite the fact that we failed a decade earlier. So in 1866, the Darul Uloom Deoband is set up. One teacher is a paid teacher. His name is Mullah Mahmood. Mullah Mahmood, so this is when Mullah Mahmood Hassan will be how old? 15. So he's 15, and he, by his father, because his father is linked to the Darul Uloom Deoband, he puts his son into the mother, enrolls him in, and that first batch of students that enroll are around 21 students. 21 students with Mullah Mahmood. And this is where the initiation of Darul Uloom Deoband starts. So this Mullah Mahmood al-Hassan is there right from the beginning. Now, from this itself, there's so much lessons to take from in terms of humble beginnings. Many a times we look at something and we look at that after that time has become successful. So when we say 2020, hindsight is 2020, what we mean by that is when we see something as being successful, then we can easily see why it succeeded. We can easily jump on the bandwagon once something is successful. But in those early years, when things are going difficult, it's very hard to see how this will be successful. You have 21 students, one teacher. 10 years ago, it was a failed mutiny. It's not looking good for Muslims. Could those original people have thought that there will be sister institutions set up in the UK, in America, all over the world? That there will be someone sitting in London speaking about the madrasa in not that long time after. We're talking about 150 years. So we're not talking about thousands of years. No, just 150 years after we're sitting here talking about that with 21 students in a very humble beginnings. So that's the origin of this Darul Uloom Deoband. That's where it starts from. And then Mahmood al-Hassan is from the very beginning, but in terms of not teacher, but as a student. The figure that he becomes very attached to, and this is what I meant by to understand a person in isolation is very difficult. There are people around them that shape them, is considered to be the brains, the mastermind behind Darul Uloom Deoband, is a scholar by the name of Maulana Qasim Nanotwi, rahimahullah, who was the main mastermind behind Darul Uloom Deoband. He was the thinker, the mufakkir, that's what we call in Arabic, a thinker. And so Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan, when he saw within him that he had this capacity, this knowledge, he would take him out from madrasa and he would come and study privately with Maulana Qasim Nanotwi. And what they would do, this setup that they had, was that this wasn't a setup of students trying to learn how to read, learn a science. No. Maulana Qasim Nanotwi's lessons were that I already assume you know what the text is saying. I already assume you know what the hadith is saying. But now allow me to provide further depth to it. If you are trying to come into those sessions with Maulana Qasim Nanotwi and not be able to read the text for yourself, you are not able to sit in those gatherings. So Mullah Mahmud al-Hasan, he spends a considerable amount of time with Mullah Qasim al-Notwi, and he builds this kind of very strong relationship up. And this is something that, again, especially for those of us living in London, because life is very hectic, it's very hard to build those kind of strong connections with teachers or strong connections with pious folk, because everyone is so rushed. So when we hear about these people that are willing to kind of die for their sheikhs, and they just want to sit there in the presence of the sheikh for hours and they don't mind, it's very hard for us to wrap our head around that, because we don't have those kind of relationships with people anymore. So this is why, like Maulana Mahmud Hasan himself, the other teacher of his that he had great respect for was Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. He would travel to Gango, which is from Deoband, some miles every Friday, to go sit in the gatherings of Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. That idea of traveling by foot and then traveling back by foot the same day, there will be something, I think it worked out to be 40-mile distance that he would have to go that one day. That's nearly 2 marathons in one day. He would go to sit in Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi's other teacher and sit in his gathering. So this is the kind of relationship, and this is the surroundings. And sometimes, we look and we reminisce about the past as being so great, and we kind of forget the realities of life. But I think here there is a justification of romanticizing the past. So this notion in history is that, when we look back in the time, when you look back in time, you always think of the past as being better than it actually is. So people look and say, oh, back in the 80s, life was great. Or back in the 2000s, that's when everyone was doing great stuff. But when you actually go back and you look at it, you think it wasn't as great as you thought it was. But this is actually one of the time periods of Darul Uloom Deoband from the 1870s to 1890s, this era. You can see people consistently going back to that era and discussing that this environment that was built was something that was not seen before. An environment of worship, an environment of not just worship, but an environment of study, of thorough study. And this is we're going to move on to our next element. So once Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, he finishes his formal studies at the age of, in the year 1872. So that would make him 21 years old. So 21 years old, he finishes his formal studies. So that would include from a child reading Quran, learning Farsi, learning Arabic, and then doing the books of what is known as logic, then usul, fiqh, hadith. So he finishes this at the age of 21 in 1872. His general sanad that is referenced for him, which goes back to the figure told by Shah Waliullah, that he studied with Maulana Qasim al-Notwi, we mentioned, who studied under Shah Abdul Ghani, who studied under Maulana Shah Muhammad Ishaq, who studied under Shah Abdul Aziz and Shah Waliullah. And the other chain of transmission that Maulana Mahmud Hasan would mention, and this is mentioned by his biographer, Maulana Asghar Hussain, who was also a senior scholar in Deoband and was a student of Shaikh-ul-Hind. He mentions that he also had a sanad from Sheikh Ahmed Saharanpuri, who is the teacher of Maulana Qasim al-Notwi, with the same sanad going back to Shah Waliullah. So in 1874, they have the first graduation in Deoband. So this would make him at the age of 23, there's this first actual graduation takes place. So 1866, the madrasa establishes, and after 8 years, you have the first graduation. People are called, it's a big event. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan gets what is known as that, it's called Dastar Bandi. They put the imam on. So he gets that in the 1874. But prior to that, he's allowed to teach in the madrasa whilst a student. So whilst a student, he's still teaching in the madrasa. And by 1878, and for students of knowledge, they will understand what this means. By 1878, he was teaching Sahih Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari, that would make him at the age of around 27. Yes, about 27, he was teaching Sahih Bukhari in Darul Uloom Deoband, which again is a great achievement for those who study in madrasa. They'll recognize this, why it's such a great achievement. But the amount of paid staff was still around 4 in Darul Uloom Deoband. There were a lot of people that would come and teach, but paid staff, they were around 4. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan didn't come, he came from not a poor family, he came from a relatively well-off family. So he was reluctant to take a wage. But there's this, again, another lesson to take is sometimes what happens is that if you are reluctant, let's say I have money, but I'm not taking a wage, it puts pressure on other teachers for taking wages. Right? So if I'm well off and I say, I don't need money, and so the institutions are going to have to give me money, but then other people need money, right? They now feel a pressure of not taking because I didn't take. So he was told that, no, you take your money, right? So don't let that, you can spend it however you want, but to refuse it is going to cause harm to other teachers, so he would not refuse the pay on behalf of that. In 1878, around just after that time period, the madrasa go on this kind of Hajj pilgrimage. And this is where all the big timers of the madrasa, they all go off together. And this includes Mullah Qasim Nanotwi, Mullah Rashid Gangohi, Shaikh-ul-Hind, Mullah Yaqub Nanotwi. A bunch of these scholars, they all go off together for Hajj. And this Hajj is spoken a lot about because they go to Mecca. And who's the scholar, who's the main individual for these people in Mecca? Is the figure by the name of Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki. Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki is the teacher, in the sense of the spiritual teacher of the founders of Deoband. That includes Mullah Qasim Nanotwi and Mullah Rashid Ahmad Gangohi. He's the spiritual guide. But if you look at his name, Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, he migrated to Mecca. When did he migrate to Mecca? After 1857, because he was involved in the uprising against the British. It failed, he had to migrate to Mecca and he set himself up there. So all the scholars, when they were until his death, when they will go to Mecca, they will make it a particular thing to go and visit this figure, Haji Imdadullah, who was based in Mecca at that time. So all of these figures, they go to Medina, they meet the mashayikh there, and then on the way back, and by this time you have to realize is that the relationship that Mullah Mahmood al-Hassan builds with Mullah Qasim Nanotwi is something which for a lot of us will struggle. So I would say best to understand this is like how a son has a relationship with their father. So that kind of relationship is built up because these people you spend hours with and they care for you, not in just imparting knowledge. It's not just like a transaction. You come here 1 hour, you teach and I give you money and then you go off. No, there's a relationship that builds up of tarbiyah. It's much more than even many of our fathers' relationship that we have. So this is the relationship that Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan builds up with Maulana Qasim Nanotwi. And in 1880, on the way back from Hajj, Maulana Qasim Nanotwi feels ill. He becomes ill. And his illness doesn't go away. And then in 1880, Maulana Qasim Nanotwi passes away. 2 days later, Maulana Ahmad Ali Sahanpuri passes away. So in the space of 2-3 days, you've got the two teachers of Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan. They pass away. He gets so struck by this that he refuses to teach. He refuses to come out. He says, I'm done. I'm finished with all this. Right? And it took him about a month to get convinced to come back, to get back into it, because it had such an impact on him that his person that was like his father, because at that time, Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan would have been 29 years old. So 29 years old when Maulana Qasim Nanotwi passed away, this had a massive impact on him. But by the passing away of these figures, right, he would say this phrase, Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan, Kabbarani mawtul kubara. Kabbarani mawtul kubara. What does that mean? He goes, I became senior because the seniors passed away. Right? Meaning, I don't deserve to be senior, but I became senior because everyone else passed away. And that's something for us to think about. What I mean by this is, when we look back at these great figures, and I'm sure you guys have studied many of these lessons and you probably heard something similar, when you hear about Nawawi, you hear about all these imams, and you say, what age were they active in? And you say, oh, they were 29, they were 30, they were 35, they were in the late 30s. Well, that's the age that a lot of us are in. So we, whether you like it or not, and whatever sad state you want to take from it, we're their inheritors. Who are we waiting for now? Right? As more and more elders pass away, whether we like it or not, kabbarani mawtul kubara. When people talk, I get introduced here, this senior guy coming, I'm looking at you, are you talking about me? Right? It's not because I am so special, it's because there's no one left. So he says, kabbarani mawtul kubara, because these people pass away, now he becomes senior. That's the humbleness of the Shaykh. Of course, he was much more than that. Now, from this time period, we have this 40 years from his graduation that he's teaching knowledge. Right? 40 years of teaching and the impact that he makes in the madrasa is something which is unparalleled. Let me try to explain this with some examples, inshallah. Because when we introduce Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan, we start off as saying, Shaikh-ul-Hind, we talk about his anti-British activities. That's all true, and we'll come to that. But that's the last portion of his life. We're talking about that's like the last 5-6 years of his life. The life before that was a life of teaching and making individuals. So there's some folks, they're not great at producing scholars, but they themselves are the great scholars. So their legacy is the scholarship they leave behind. And there's some figures that they themselves may not have been so competent in terms of scholarship, but they leave behind a legacy of scholars. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan is one of the unique personalities that does both. And not only does he leave behind scholarship of his own, but he produces scholars. So if, again, for those who know names of scholars, just to understand the people that have studied with Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan. We have with these names, I'm going to drop some names, so you, for those who know, they know. From his students, the common days, Maulana Shabir Ahmed Uthmani, Alama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi, Maulana Hussein Ahmed Badini, Mufti Kifayatullah, Maulana Asghar Hussein, Maulana Manazi Ahsan Gilani. That's a significant pool of people that he leaves behind. And that comes under the 40 plus years of him teaching. And we're talking about a schedule that would have around 11 to 12 lessons a day. 11 to 12 lessons a day with his personal reading and his family. That was the, and this is, again, to take lesson from this, is that if you want to achieve anything, there's some young people here studying, you want to achieve anything in knowledge, make your life simple. Simplify things. Don't overcomplicate things. Don't get overly involved in things so early, right? Simplify your life, make time, but then make yourself effective to that. But that's not a generic advice. What's interesting was that Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan has one of these students came to him and he said, Sheikh, I teach in the Darul Uloom Deoband, but I'm here for like 12 hours. You know, we talk about long hours they would do, right? 10 hours teaching, 12 hours, and I can't do any writing, right? I've been offered a professorship. I will do a fraction of the hours of teaching. I can sit and do writing and, you know, read and do all the stuff I want. So Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan turns to him and says to him that you're not going to do anything, right? Go if you want, but I wouldn't advise it, but you're not going to do anything. And this is why we all experience is that when people take a gap year, you think this 1 year, I'm going to study like I've never studied before. But what happens? That year you do everything but study. Because you say, well, I still got 8 hours. You got 4 hours left. Okay, tomorrow I still got all day free. I'm going to wake up after Fajr. Then plans get more drastic. I'm going to wake up before Fajr, right? But nothing ever happens. And so there has to be a balance between being occupied in good and trying to, and so you can achieve sometimes more with occupied. That's just his wisdom in terms of, that doesn't apply to everyone. If there's someone, but just simplify your existence. Stop being overly complicated with likes and dislikes, too many pet likes, pet hates. Be very simple, easygoing, read in all capacities. Don't say I have to read when there's like a nice fire, nice temperature, then we'll read. No, read in all capacities. It should be a simple type of existence that you're trying to build up. Anyway, so in this time period, there's a few incidents that I want to mention. Now, when we look at the biographers of Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, in terms of how do you do his bio? Now, the issue we have here is that you have like 5, 6, if not more, dedicated biographies of Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, which becomes very difficult. How do you navigate through all of that? And what makes things more detailed is the fact that we talk about thousands of students, and many of them sat and they documented their relationship with Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan. So the amount of information you have about this person is overwhelming. Honestly, when I was going through because I normally study these figures in terms of the scholarship, but looking at their life, I thought I'll read a few, but then the amount of material out there is amazing. In terms of one thing that stands out, and this is something you'll find in those who study in Darul Ulooms would probably attest to much more in these madrasa institutions that we're talking about, is there's a strong push of humbleness in terms of there should be simplicity in your attire, simplicity in your lifestyle. And a person should never have an inflated ego about themselves. There should always be an idea that you're nothing, you're worthless. And Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, he kind of embodies this characteristic as well. Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi mentions that in one of these settings, they were sitting there and they were discussing why students are not doing great in madrasa. So a conversation that we probably have every year, every madrasa, like what's happened? But now this is talking back in the 1880s, whatever time period would have been in, right? They're sitting there, they're saying, why is the isti'adad? Why is the standard of students decreasing? So then teachers as well saying that, look, it's because the students have become lazy. Students don't read anymore. They don't have that enthusiasm that we had back in our days. One of the students of Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan was a teacher as well in the madrasa. He said, you know, why are we blaming the students for? We should blame the teachers. Now, of course, when he's saying blame the teachers, he's not referring to Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, right? That's his sheikh. It's not, no one's referring to him. So Mahmud al-Hasan he goes, that's true. Am I incompetent myself in teaching? It's the mindset of someone, which is that you're constantly concerned about your faults, not the faults of others. So that epitome, that kind of embodies the characteristics of Mahmud al-Hasan. Never trying to, he always refused to give a talk, only talk when he was forced to. This is the kind of mindset that Mawlana Ashwaitani mentions regarding him. In terms of scholarship, what did he write? Most of his works, I think, not all his works, I would like to say, are in Urdu. Most of his works in Urdu. Probably the most famous and impactful work that he wrote was his translation of the Quran. His translation of the Quran, which was very well spread, published multiple times. This translation of the Quran by Mawlana Mahmud is a very popular contribution. And there's a reason why he did this as well. We'll come back to that. Then, as everyone is Abna'u Zaman, we are the offspring of our era. So during his time period, we mentioned the Ahl Hadith and the Hanafi dispute. This idea of fiqh, is the Hanafi school doing fiqh the correct way? So Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan is part of the tradition that the Hanafi school coincides with hadith. So he writes a book called Adilla Kamila, which is providing evidences for specific Hanafi topics. Another book is Ahsan al-Qura, which is this debate which doesn't apply to us now, but can you pray Jummah Salah in villages? So the Hanafi say you can't pray Jummah Salah in villages, whereas other schools of thought say you can pray Jummah Salah in villages. Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan defends the Hanafi position. These are very unique niche topics. Then there is a topic about what is known as Ilmul Kalam. This is Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan's book, which is called Al-Jahdul Muqil. There's different ways of pronouncing this book, right? The recent publication has it as Al-Jahdul Muqil, which is a very niche topic. I think if I mention it here, it will probably cause a debate, so I'll probably leave the topic out. But that's another book of Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan that he authored. So this is, in terms of his authorship, it's not and it's also got comments on the books of hadith as well, that's published, many of these are published, but it's not a massive repository of works, but it's significant nonetheless. Most of his focus was on teaching and making scholars, and he was very successful in that. Now, moving on to what most people have heard about, and what we want to kind of focus into, because we can go on talking about, I mentioned one book, Mawlana Ashwaitani, another work, I was listing, I forgot, I ran off topic. Another work, which is interesting to read nonetheless, alongside many, which I was going through, is Mufti Muhammad Shafi', who was a student of Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan. When he passed away, this is the father of Mufti Muhammad Taqi al-Uthmani, Hafidhullah. When Mufti Muhammad Shafi' rahimahullah passed away, Darul Uloom Karachi, which is a madrasa he was in, they did a special number. So what they do is they do a special volume for the Shaykh. It's about 1300 pages. One part of that is Mufti Taqi Uthmani, who's still alive, his son. He writes about the teachers of his father, Mufti Muhammad Shafi'. In the section of Mahmud al-Hasan, he lists the relationship that Mufti Shafi' has with his Shaykh, the stuff that he records from him. It's very nice read. It's these kind of anecdotes. It's very nice to get into the mindset of Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan. In one time, just kind of explain this point, Mufti Muhammad Shafi' says that in one of the lessons, Mufti Mawlana Mahmud al-Hasan, he gave the evidences for the Hanafi school against the Shafi'i school with great depth. And it was an amazing lesson, meaning the evidence that he gave, it was so compelling that I or someone went to him after and said, you know what, if Imam Shafi'i was here, he would follow what you said. If Imam Shafi'i himself was here, he would follow what you said. So Mahmud al-Hasan said, if Imam Shafi'i was alive today, I'll probably be a Shafi'i, right? So this is like the mindset of him, and you can read a bunch of these anecdotes to get into the understanding of their scholarship, but with scholarship comes etiquette. With scholarship it comes, which is anzilun nasa manazilahum. That just because I can critique an individual, that doesn't mean that I'm anywhere par with that individual. You can make individual critiques of people, but trying to take down the whole character of an individual is something we have to be very careful of. So even if that sentiment may be given in class, that look, you're refuting Imam Shafi'i, don't try to get students the idea that we're on par with Imam Shafi'i. So he puts that back into place. And so you have these kind of anecdotes which are very useful to read. Anyway, so moving back to the political issue, is that the Muslims that are living in the Darul Uloom Deoband that's established, this is not anti-establishment madrasa, meaning the idea of the madrasa to run. You can't be anti-British. But the second you start to voice anti-British stance, the madrasa is closed. So as long as you carry on teaching, that's fine. So this is what the madrasa does. For many years, they continue teaching, continue producing students, and this grows and grows. Many what is known as sister institutions. So the way it would work is, let's say you graduate from Darul Uloom Deoband. You go back to your own residency, you set up a madrasa there, and then the people there come and study. People graduate again, they go to a different place. And these are sister institutions. Within 10 years, we have like 8, 9 different madrasas established after Darul Uloom Deoband. That's the idea of it. So it spreads. But the oppression of the British on the Muslims specifically, but also on the Indians in general, which includes Hindus, Sikhs, all of them, but Muslims more specifically, starts to worsen. And now there starts to become calls for, now we can maybe get together and try to oust the British either politically or some way or one another. It's during this time period in the 1910, they have a madrasa reunion, which is that we're going to set up a thing called Jami'atul Ansar, and all the graduates of Darul Uloom Deoband, they'll start coming back. So alumni, they come back together. So we're talking about lots of students. Amongst these people that comes back is a figure by the name of Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi. Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, again, is a figure that has a separate study for, very unique personality. So Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, who was a young Sikh convert to Islam. So he was Sikh, he converted to Islam, he enrolled in Darul Uloom Deoband, sat with Imam Mahmood al-Hasan, graduated, and then had these big ideas of ousting the British. That was his goal. So he comes back here and they set up this kind of alumni to get together. It doesn't work out too well. But eventually, Ubaidullah Sindhi and Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan, the details of this are a bit cryptic. But they come to his eventual conclusion that the way to oust the British is that we need to ally with the enemies of Britain. So if we can ally with the Ottomans, ally with the Germans, if you can get the Afghan support, because many of the Darul Uloom Deoband students are from Afghanistan. So if I can go there and get their support, maybe we can produce an alliance to think about ousting the British. That was the idea of Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi. So Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi then in 1915, 16, I can't the exact dates, he goes off to Afghanistan to set to kind of build these kind of relationships. Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan is now an old man. Remember, 1851, he's born. We're now talking about 1950. So we're talking around 64, am I maths right? 64 years old, about approximately that age, right? So he's old man. As I told you before, he was never a big build, but he's in his old age now. So he announces that, and he's got a very big position in Darul Uloom Deoband. Remember, thousands of students, big names. You know, probably one of the most celebrated scholar, respected scholar in whole of India at this time. So he comes under, he makes an announcement that I'm going for Hajj. Many get this impression that he's going to do hijrah, he's going to migrate. So therefore, the madrasa is losing a person. But to the contrary, Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan says that I'm planning to come back. I'm going to do Hajj, I'm planning to come back. So it's a bit mysterious, but he goes off and a few of his people, they go with him. Now this is now known as what becomes eventually known as the time that Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan spends in the prisons of Malta, and more specifically known as the Silk Letter Conspiracy. We'll come back to this in a second. So Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan goes off to do his Hajj. He goes to Medina. There's a long story. Again, if you want to read something in English, there's a book called The Prisoners of Malta. You'll find it online, The Prisoners of Malta. Alternatively, there's another book in English called The Silk Letter Conspiracy. If you write these in English online, you'll see the book, the PDFs come up. You can read it in detail if you want. You can purchase the books even better. So I'm not going to detail all of that. But eventually what happens is, in 1916, Shaikh-ul-Hind Mahmud al-Hasan, he's in Ta'if at the time. So now he's in Ta'if, he does the Hajj, second Hajj, now he's in Ta'if. And the revolt of the Sharif Hussein takes place. So what's happening in what we call Saudi Arabia, there's no Saudi Arabia at this time, right? So in Saudi Arabia established a decade later. In this time period during the First World War, the Sharif family are also vowing for power in the Hijaz. But who's in power? The Ottomans. So the Sharif Hussein, with the backing of the British, they take over the Hijaz and they kill and they oust the Ottomans, and Maulana Mahmood al-Hasan is in Ta'if. So they're surrounded, these people are dying of hunger, they get bits of food, they stay there for about 2 months. Ramadan comes, they do Ramadan there. There's all of incident stories mentioned about how they go through difficult times at that time. As that's going on, Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi currently is in Afghanistan trying to garner support. There, he writes this cryptic secret letter written on silk in yellow that you can't see too well. But there's already suspicion from the British that what are these guys doing? Why is this guy going to Afghanistan? Why is this senior scholar gone off to the Hijaz? So one of these letters eventually gets intercepted where the plans of Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi is mentioned. He talks about what the detail of the plans are. On the same time, there are fatwa going out from after Sharif Hussein has taken over the Hijaz that get the ulama to sign a fatwa that the Ottomans are disbelievers and they have no relationship to the Khilafah. So when Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan is then presented, say, you must also sign this. When he looks at this fatwa to sign, he says, he goes out in the technicality. He goes, this says the scholars of Mecca. I'm not from the scholars of Mecca. I've got nothing to do with this. But that grows suspicion. So eventually the British told Sharif Hussein that you must give Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan and his rufaqa, his people with him, to us. Who are his rufaqa? There are 5 people altogether. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, and then we have probably his most beloved and close student, Maulana Hussein Ahmed Madani. And then we have 3 other people we'll come to in a second, inshallah. So these 5 eventually get arrested. Again, there's a long story regarding the arrest. And they're taken initially by the British now, they hand over to the British, and they're taken to Egypt, they're taken to Cairo. In Cairo, they stay there for a little while and they're interrogated. Questions are put forward to them. Are you trying to, establish a rebellion against the British? Mahmud Hassan says, I'm an old man. What am I going to do? Right? I don't have any these kind of high aspirations. Because the idea was that this was, and let's just be clear here, that's all the plan was. The plan failed. Right? The plan failed. It didn't work. The idea of Mahmud Hassan, they were so successful in Afghanistan. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, his 4 students, they all get arrested. Haji, his name Nusrat Hussain, who was a 20-year-old boy at that time, who was with him, was arrested. When he was taken to prison, in the prison of Malta, he died at the age of 22. Right? So by all intents and purposes, it was a miserable failure. But that's not how we view things, because Allah Ta'ala works in amazing ways. So sometimes we look at something. We're not talking about the Silk Letter conspiracy and movement, or what is known in Urdu as Tahriq Reshmi Roman, as a failure. Why? Because that's an inspiration for all the anti-British movements that come after. But if I was sitting in 1918 or 1917, and there were people like this, they said, that's a failure. Look what he did. Why? Because before Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan goes to this whole Hajj thing starts, in the Madrasa of Darul Uloom Deoband, it becomes divided. Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan is saying we need to be more politically active. The other camp of Darul Uloom Deoband's teachers saying, why? We're running a good show here. Let us carry on. You're going to start saying anti-British, get into politics. That's the Madrasa finished. Leave yourself to yourself. Again, there's a very nice work, if anyone has time to read it. It's in Urdu, but it's a partial translation done to it by Muhammad Qasim Zaman. But the Urdu is called, the book is by Maulana Manazi Ahsan Gilani, who was a young scholar at that time. And he talks about spending a day in Darul Uloom Deoband. So like he talks about his time that day. So a time in Darul Uloom Deoband as a young scholar, or sorry, as a young student. So he mentions that in Darul Uloom Deoband, this is before Maulana Mahmud Hassan goes, there's a debate taking place. Some of the scholars are condemning Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, saying in the madrasa that this guy is causing political strife, going to get the madrasa in trouble. So Maulana Manazi Ahsan Gilani goes, I went to Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan and I sat with him and I said, Hazrat, what's going on here? What's this accusation being placed against you? That the madrasa is doing well. Why are you causing trouble for? So Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan, who has the most right in terms of relationship with Maulana Qasim al-Nawatwi, because of that relationship extent, he was from the first students of Darul Uloom Deoband. He goes, do you think that Maulana Qasim al-Nawatwi establishes madrasa just for education? To the contrary, the 1857 failure, the madrasa was meant to be a means of revival. That was his mindset. So when he went off and he was arrested, some people in the madrasa, they mentioned this, some in the madrasa saying, we told you so. Right? And they spent that time saying, if you listen to us, this would have happened. Of course, these people are sincere folks as well. You don't want to speak ill of them, but that was the idea. So then Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan and the 4 companions of him, they got then sent to Malta prison. And what's interesting here is when I read something to you guys, inshallah. In English, if anyone's interested in reading something, there's a very good book written by Barbara Metcalf in English about Hussein Ahmed Madani. Right? If you read the first part of this work, it talks about this. But what's interesting is that what she does is she provides the content in terms of what the British were saying about these 5 people. So with the official documents of the British, they said, Maulana Mahmood Hassan, son of Zulfiqar Ali, at that time was now around 70 years old. They write, the British write, this was the threat they received. He should be treated as a political detainee who has been against us from religious conviction and not as a common self-seeking conspirator, meaning Mahmood Hassan should be seen as someone who is religiously motivated against us. He's not just someone that is for his personal reasons. It is desired that his presence should not become known to the public. To ensure this, such precaution as possible should be taken. Why? Because once he was put in the prison of Malta, they thought, if we let him out now, he'll come as a hero. So what do you do with this guy? The second person that was with him was Maulana Hussein Ahmed, son of Habibullah, who was 38 years old. What do they write? There is no doubt that any young Muslim coming into contact with him will be in danger of being converted to his views and becoming disloyal to the British. Besides being dangerous in this way, he is an energetic man, quite capable of taking active part in politics and in a religious disguise. The third person that was with Maulana Mahmood Hassan was a person, his name comes as Aziz, some as Uzair Gul, age 26. This man was accompanying Maulana Mahmood Hassan on the SS Akbar, the ship. He is an irreconcilable hater and requires very strict supervision and control. There is no reason to show him consideration as in the case of the old Maulana. That's what they're saying about him. Then they had Wahid Ahmed, who was the nephew of Maulana Hussein Ahmed Badri. And then you had Hakim Nusrat Hussain, who was 28 at that time. So Wahid Ahmed was 20, Nusrat Hussain was 28 at that time, and this is the one that passed away in Malta from sickness, such that he was told when he was sick that you can leave, you're not actually put on trial or anything. He says, I refuse to leave, I'll spend my time with Maulana Mahmood Hassan. So Maulana Mahmood Hassan in 1916 is then taken to the prisons of Malta. For what? Conspiracy. So he's there for about 3.5 years. And a lot happens at 3.5 years, but what does Maulana Mahmood Hassan do within those 3.5 years in terms of, because remember, the first and foremost people were scholars. So he takes that time to finish off his translation of the Quran. So the book that we have, that he translates the Quran, a large amount of that was done in the prisons of Malta. Not only that, he carried on his teaching of Mishkat. He would teach the Mishkat in the prisons of Malta, and he was an old man, people showed him a great amount of respect. Maulana Hussein Ahmed Madani, these 4 people with him didn't have to be there. There was no trial on them. It was only on Maulana Mahmood Hassan. But these 4 people sacrificed 3.5 years of their time to spend with their Sheikh Maulana Mahmood Hassan. And something that when I read, it kind of shook me to some degree, was that when Maulana Mahmood Hassan was in the prisons of Malta, Maulana Hussein Ahmed Madani, his student, was with him. He didn't have to be, but he chose to be with him. Right? He chose to stick it out with him. During this time period when Maulana Hussein Madani was in the prison, it says that the Turks in Medina, facing the Sharif's revolt, arrested Hussein Ahmed Madani's father and 2 brothers. So while he was in prison, his father is arrested and Maulana Madani's 2 brothers are arrested, Sayyid Ahmed and Mahmoud Ahmed, as British subjects, and transported them to Turkey along with other Indians and Arab supporters of the British. Habibullah, Hussein Ahmed's father, died in Adropol. This blow was the greatest since Habibullah's cherished hope in immigration to Medina had been to be buried with the Prophet Muhammad's own city. So Maulana Hussein al-Madani's father, this is what it means, you have to go understand his background. He was based in India, so he takes all his family back in the 1880s, whenever it was, to Medina to live and die in Medina. So he spends a lot of difficulty. He eventually gets to his old ages in Medina, but now he's arrested. He's arrested, he's taken out to Turkey, and then he dies there. He doesn't get to die in Medina, which was his dream. The women and children left behind in Medina were not only bereft of male support, but suffered the deprivations caused by the British blockade. Hussein Ahmed's, Muhammadani's stepmother, his wife, his 18-month-old son Ashfaq Ahmed, and Sayyid Ahmed's wife and daughter all died during this 3.5 period. Left in Medina were only his own 10-year-old daughter Zuhra and Mahmoud Ahmed's wife, who after great difficulties reached Andropol. On the return journey to Medina, while traveling through Syria, little Zuhra will also die. He gets these letters not one by one, because as letters were being written to him, he didn't get one by one, this person. He basically got all the letters in one go. So in one go, he was given the pile of letters and all the deaths were written to him in one go. So that's the sacrifice that Maulana Hussein al-Madani did for who? His sheikh, right? So these are things that, we forget. Not only what we forget also is that Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan had a wife. What happened to her? So when he was leaving, Mullah Mahmud Hassan's wife was very old and fragile at that time. She was also sick. Mullah Mahmud Hassan said, look, I'm coming back in 6 months, inshallah. But during that time period, she was in and out of the sickness. And so eventually in 1920, when he's released, he comes back to India, and his wife is on her last stage, meaning she's not really gaining consciousness. She has a bit of understanding that he's there, and then she passes away shortly after Mullah Mahmud Hassan comes. So there's so much, difficulty, because when we talk about these figures of the past, there's an element of these people not being real humans, not real emotions. They're just warriors. They just want to go fight. And that's true to some degree. But that inner emotion, the difficulties that life comes to them, is sometimes overplayed and not taken into consideration. So Mullah Mahmud al-Hassan, when he gets back to, after the war is over, and the British are starting to release people from Malta. Okay, Malta is 3,000 people in that prison. It's a massive place, right? And so the Indian are together. There's about 7, 8 of them. There's a few other people in Syria, different regions. And so as people are being released, constant news is coming back. So right now in India, the lobbying, trying to get these ulama free is what's being put pressure on. But it's not working. It's been delayed. It's been delayed. Eventually, only around 20 people are left in Malta, including our 4 people. One passed away, so 4 people are left. So eventually in 1920, 12th March 1920, Mullah Mahmud al-Hassan is released, and then some months later he gets back into India. When he comes back into India, now he's even older, more fragile than he was, and he goes through this kind of tour back, and he's released, and he's taken in as a hero. It's at that time period that the title of Shaikh-ul-Hind comes. It's at that time period. Shaikh-ul-Hind comes when he is 70, right at the end. He was never known as Shaikh-ul-Hind. It was known as Mahmud al-Hassan. There's another name, I forget right now, that he was known by. But he was never known as Shaikh-ul-Hind. So we look back at his life and we call him Shaikh-ul-Hind, but that was in the last few months of his life that he got that title. So when he comes back, he doesn't come back with this kind of desire of being hurt by it. To the contrary, he says that there's 2 things. So Mufti Muhammad Shafi mentioned this. It was when he came back, he would have these gatherings in Deoband, because he finally gets back to Deoband, his family meet him, and he spends time in the madrasa, because that was his home. Madrasa is where he spent 4 years. He actually, when he first came back, he went to the Darul Hadith and he made dua there. So this was his first, like his home from home. So in a gathering, he sits there, and Mufti Muhammad Shafi goes, that Mahmud Hassan sat, and he goes, there's 2 lessons. This is something that we can end on, inshallah. There's 2 lessons that I've learned that I think we need to focus on. And I think these lessons are still something that we can work on. He says, number 1 is that the reason why Muslims are in decline is there's a lack of relationship that people have with the Quran. There has to be not just reading, but understanding of Quran for everyone. Even children should have some sort of relationship with the Quran in terms of understanding. That's what goes back to his last project of doing the translation of the Quran, was to try to make the Quran accessible to everyone, so you have a direct relationship with the Quran. The relationship is not built through personalities. Why is that important? If, for example, I'm your teacher, or I'm the guy that you're listening to, and I, na'udhu billah, fall into some wrong. If I am your source of knowledge, that means that you have now broken off your connection to Allah, because I'm your source. Why make a fallible human being your only source to the Quran, which is accessible to you? Build your relationship with the Quran itself. The Quran will never let you down. I will let you down. The second thing he mentioned, he goes, the thing that I thought, and because Mahmud al-Hassan was engaged in debates before he went. He was someone that was active in the debate scene, but he was active in the debate scene. But he goes, the second thing I find is that there has to be a great amount of impact on trying to build Muslim unity. The infighting of Muslims has destroyed us. There has to be a way of unifying, such that Mahmud Hassan does it for amal, for practice. What does he do? He reaches out to Aligarh University. Aligarh University represents the other way of looking at Islam and Muslims, which is what we call modernist way, right? That's what they accuse him of. And rightly so in many degrees. So he reaches out to them to share ties with them. In this last few months, he shows support for the Indian National Congress. When he actually comes to India, when he comes to Mumbai, the person who comes to me amongst many scholars was Mahatma Gandhi. He was there as well. So he starts this initial relationship building with the Indian National Congress and supports the call for boycott. So you can see the various attempts that the ulama did, and this is something that we take lesson from. We don't look at history to say what they did, we will do. What we find that history is that in 1857, you see a material attempt, a physical attempt to kind of fight. It doesn't work, no worries. Then we see an institution building. That's partially successful. You see an attempt at making an alliance. Doesn't work. Then you go for other types of alliances. Let's go for a boycott. Let's boycott British products. Let's see how that works. We won't necessarily see the fruits of our success, but it's the effort that we make, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, that will be taken answer for. When we look back at the seerah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we look at the life of Sumayya radiallahu anha. She's from the early Muslims of Islam. She was martyred. She didn't see Fathu Makkah. She didn't see Hijrah. She didn't see Badr. She didn't see anything. But do we look at that and say that's a failure? Would anyone look at that and say, look, she failed? So similarly, we look back at the prisons, the 3.5 years, they didn't achieve anything in terms of what the goal was. Afghanistan didn't support them. There was no military coup. There's nothing. But it's the intent that's behind it that they were rewarded for. And sometimes the benefit of these come years in later. So we look back at Shaikh-ul-Hind and we're still inspired by what we would sometimes word as a relative failure. So it's something that we take lesson with. And so on his passing away, just the last point I want to mention is that Maulana Shabir Ahmed Usmani, who was one of his close students, he mentions that near the death of Maulana Mahmood al-Hassan, he was there. So he goes, the Hazrat Rahimullah opened his eyes and looked momentarily at the ceiling. So he was in Delhi because he was constantly sick, and they eventually took him to Delhi to take a cure there. And he said, so when he opened his eyes, he said, last words he said was, I have no regret about death. However, I regret over the fact that I am dying on my bed. It was always my desire to die on the battlefield of jihad, and that I be chopped into pieces for the crime of elevating the word of Allah Ta'ala. He then repeated the word Allah 7 times in a loud voice, and his voice fell at the 8th time. And that's when he passed away. As a final wedding. So he himself desired and didn't mind the prisons of Malta. But the thing that worried him was that his students were with him as well. So that was the thing that concerned him, and that's the difficulties that we always have to kind of weigh up whenever trying to do any good in our life. And with that, I'll try to finish that up, inshallah. We've gone, I think, over time. Do questions, or are we okay? If you want to ask any questions, I'm more than happy to take them, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.